shows up. So I'm excited to be connecting with Gear Focus and spending some time with you guys today for a couple reasons. One, Matt and I had the opportunity to connect and talk. I really support the mission of Gear Focus. It's nice to have a group focused with one individual, essentially with Matt, focused so much on the needs of photographers versus a bigger corporation or something else. And so Matt's a nice guy. It's a good group. I think he's going to build a great community. So I'm honored to be here to present. So for me, the natural world is kind of my spiritual house to a large degree. And things there within the spiritual realms oftentimes look, there's that element of almost affectionate looks. And so I was drawn to, and in my photography work, I didn't give much thought to composition or any types of emotion really early on in my journey. And I suspect in not giving thought to composition and the emotional impacts of composition, I probably gave up a lot of opportunities that were in fact incredible displays of nature, where I lost opportunity to tell stories. I lost opportunity to connect with others through my work. So what drove me to the outdoors was not photography to begin with, but my love for the immensity and the power of nature. But it's been through photography that I've been able to connect at much deeper levels to this really amazing natural world. And I'm starting to be able to put into words a fraction of what I feel out there with nature. So my photography has grown by leaps and bounds since I've made the choice to connect emotionally with what I'm feeling and I'm seeing within the field. And what it has allowed me to do is to progress and to see things differently. Rather than seeing a tree and a sky in this instance as separate objects, I really started to see the intertwining of the lines within the trees, the shapes within the tree, the textures within the skies and the trees and the areas surrounding, the highlights, the shadows, and how these things started to work together. I've become more connected to my work, and in being more connected to my work, I've seen dramatic improvements in my satisfaction and also that feeling of uniqueness and what I'm producing and understanding much, much more of how things work together in a much more cohesive way, which is my intention for today. So one thing to think about as photographers, this is an old advertisement from early 2000s of outdoor photographer that I recently found. I thought it was really interesting. And it talks Canon put this on, and it talks about that obsession we have over the details. And they put an eye tracker on a photographer named Joel Grimes as he edited his images to see exactly where he looked and in what elements and levels. And so there's, different types of composition, but we start to see triangle formations in terms of his focus between the hands and the face, and how other parts of the image he doesn't spend much time really looking at. And I think that's a key element of composition we'll talk about, is there's definitely distinct areas within our images we're going to want to be focusing as we frame up and we take and then process our shots as we look through this. So the next part of this, or the part before we talk about it, is what I call the trifecta of landscape photography. And there's three elements that go into compelling images for me. And this is very specific to landscape. It's composition, it's light, and it's color. And the role of composition is vitally important because this provides the structure and the interaction with our images. So without composition, you could still have some good light, but where and how is your image standing? And without composition, you could have some mood and emotion, but you're not going to be communicating elements of visual depth. You're not going to be able to show and demonstrate things of transition, etc. And so getting all three of these to fire on all cylinders is really a key element. You can't neglect one and expect the other two to really pick up the slack if you want to be working with compelling images. So how do we define composition? It's the the arrangement into specific proportion or relation, especially into artistic form. And so composition becomes about proportions of the elements in our images and how we can arrange those in artistic ways. But this isn't moving boulders or transplanting trees or dredging waterways. It's rather about how we think of arranging ourselves and these objects in such a way where we get visual flow. So think of building a home. The first thing you need to start with is a foundation. These are the more basic and technical parts of our images. This is the camera settings, where we choose to photograph, how we choose to capture the scene, maybe what time of day, etc. What we need to understand and put some thought into put more thought into this, but this is not composition. The next part of the home we are building is the structure, the walls themselves. These are the things that rest upon the foundations that we've created. The composition starts to take some form, but it's not the complete picture. To complete our home, or in this case, our images, we do need some aesthetics. It's a home that has color on the walls, the furniture, and the light within your home. So as we align these three things, the foundation, which is the basic building blocks, the what, where, is, I, the structure, where we take shape, in the aesthetics, the attractive portions, the light, and the color, we get that illustration of vision, and it starts to go forward. So next, I'll show you real quick. So this is Death Valley. This isn't from the 134-degree summer we had in August here. This is from a couple of years ago in the winter. And this is an interesting place to play around with how you might want to arrange things in a pleasing manner. So this is a mud crack down in between two sand dunes. And for me, it was walking these mud flats and thinking about how I would move myself within the scene and what was the most compelling way to guide the viewer through the images. So trying different angles, trying different heights, trying different focal lengths to try to figure out what I liked and what led you into the scene while still showing the textures and cracks that made this scene so interesting. So ultimately, this is my winner. And the reason I like this image is that line that grabs you right away and leads you into the scene, with the radiating lines that push us into the scene further and back towards that glow of the setting sun. But we also have other details, other supporting elements of the image. We have the cracks on the mud. We have the smaller cracks that are also working in a cohesive manner, which allows us to explore this image, look at the textures more, take in the details, etc. And so intentional images bring forth a lot more interaction as we go through it. And composition is not about adhering to checklists. I got a couple questions ahead of time of the must-dos or the must vital things related to composition. It's not a checklist. It's not rule adherence. But what it is about is using the tools we have acquired. This is some of the technical things like tripods or filters, or techniques like depth of field and focus. But all the tools mean nothing without the ultimate tool, which is us as the photographer. So here's the Oceano Dunes, just south of San Luis Obispo, here where I live on the Central Coast. It's a unique place where we have sand dunes that go directly out to the beach. And this one was about using my tools this particular day. My first tool was photo pills. Photo pills helped me to determine the alignment of the image relative to the alignment of the Milky Way, but it also helped me to pinpoint the ideal time to capture my images. So as I walked the dunes in the golden hour and looked at different compositions, I could get a sense of where the Milky Way would be and to begin to plan accordingly. So I knew from past experiences that the textures I wanted to show, the lines in the dunes, would not show up as I photographed the night sky. So this is the night sky image as I captured the Milky Way. None of these lines, none of these details, nothing within the sand itself, but just the beautiful sky. So the next tool I turned to was I'd photographed about 45 minutes earlier at the end of blue hour to get the faint enough light to show the lines and the textures I wanted, the composition for my image to stand, to pull together and tell a more compelling story, which is this. I simply just blended these two exposures together with a simple blend in Photoshop, and I had a more cohesive image that had much more storytelling, much more interaction from the viewer through the image. And so the third part of how we define composition is a way to invite the viewer into what we saw, felt, or want to show, or how we want to show tell our subject's story. Telling the story of our subjects within a mostly silent landscape is difficult, but what it does is it takes some thought and planning into what would be the compelling elements within there. So here's another area. This is in Montana de Oro, here close to San Luis Obispo, and I found this really unique sea arch. Or, looking through this, it was not a sea cave, but a beautiful arch. And I was fascinated by this image, which I had the vision called window to the world. So I'm using the composition principles we'll talk about of called framing. But I needed to think what could or would make this into a more compelling image. And I got my answer a couple weeks later. The forecast called for strong winds, some 18-foot waves, some really nice clouds, some sunset time as well. And I was then able to invite my viewers into the world. I was no longer just looking at some cool rock textures and some water. And now I was looking at the energy of the ocean, the beauty of the clouds, the able to frame this in here and really keep the eye contained within this image. So one world of this scene is one of the examples of how we do it. And the other part is the convergence, where we're looking for convergence in the most ideal sense of emotional mood, light, and other things. And so non-obvious shapes is where the other things come through. This is where we're challenged as creatives and as artists to move past the obvious and into the more obscure. Many of us know mood and images and how we can find obvious light, but how do we bring the convergence together of these with something that is not obvious? So this is as remote as I've ever been. This is Greenland. These small flecks of white you see down below are massive icebergs, actually. And these peaks in the distance are 5,000 vertical feet peaks. This image is that convergence of light and mood. But it's the non-obvious shapes that begin to tie this together. We have the arc that's forming from the bright clouds on one side, kind of following along to the brighter clouds on the other side, giving the eye an opportunity to move through. We also have the lines that are formed by the bay that guide the image, guide the eye through the image and control and contain it. So there isn't a lot of places for it to drift out. We also have the exploration of the triangles of the peaks on the right. These create movement, the ups and downs, and encourage you to stay and explore some more. All these things work together to bring about that convergence of mood, light, shape. And what do they mean? Well, stick around. So good composition is about the visual flow in an image and how we use these things in a pleasing manner. So how do we put things together in a way that guides the eye through the image in a pleasing manner? Strong composition, I would say, is rarely a thing of chance, luck, or just something you stumble upon. This is Shell Beach, just north of Pismo Beach, just south of here. And this was a super low king tide. We get these around the full moons in the winter months when the tides will be several feet higher or several feet lower than their normal numbers. What we get is it exposes new lines and patterns that you don't typically see. So if we stop and we look at this image, what do we really see? Thinking about the textures. How about the colors? Thinking about how we feel as the eye works its way through this image. Thinking a little bit about what do we look at first? Maybe what do we look at last? And what thoughts come to mind as you look at an image like this? So good composition is about visual flow in an image. How you use everything together in a manner to guide the viewer's eye through your image in a pleasing manner and encourage them to stay and explore longer. So we'd be thinking about where you want the viewer to enter. What are the elements that are keeping them in the image? What are you or they feeling emotionally? And how are they or you following subconscious lines and shapes? So now we get to talk about the composition rules, or rather, as I would like to think about them, the composition guidelines. These are 19 guidelines or planning tools that hopefully you can use in your photography. I will send this one along with a couple other ones on shapes and lines that are coming up. So don't feel like you need to take a picture or frantically write down. So one of the top rules that we hear about is the rule of thirds. The intention of the rule of thirds is to give space between the objects in your image. Through this space, you can find ways of areas of interest between the power points. So the power points are the crosshairs where things cross within our image. And so for this image, there was a lot to see and a lot to win in. I wanted to give my viewer a place to stand in the image and give it some depth to the water below. I wanted the eye to be able to wander through the image. Ideally, maybe I would have been a little bit higher, so this middle part didn't have anything here and I could have gone through. But we have to take what we're given in those particular areas. And that day I didn't have any dynamite, nor is it something that's approved for Lake Powell. So this is where I went to show the movement through. And what also happens is the eye wants to make order out of the chaos. What makes the rules of thirds so important is the math behind it. The rule of thirds divides this image into 9 boxes with typically uninteresting elements, which you can see here, also called dead space, that are located in some portions of the image. What this allows the eye to do is basically to discard those images as areas that are just not interesting, like the bottom left and the top right, and then spend more time in the areas of interest, exploring the lines and the textures. And so the rule of thirds is a good rule to understand for certain types of images, especially related to having your areas of focus and putting balance. The number 2 most referenced rule is what's called leading lines. And leading lines get you into the scene. They're vertical lines that pull you from the foreground and give your eye a place to go within the image. Most importantly, or more importantly, encourages the mind to also begin to explore the image. What leading lines provide is a path into the image. And I think it's psychologically based in you being able to find order and direction within nature. As we all know, it can be found to be very chaotic. Leading lines tell the viewer exactly where you want them to start. So this image in Death Valley, very intentional about how I positioned my camera of where I wanted the viewer to start within my image and how I wanted them to work within my scene. So the next rule, rule number 3 of the 3 that I like the most, I guess you could say, they're not, some of them aren't in particular order, is the concept of symmetry, where half of the image mirrors the other half. What happens here is this gives the brain rest. There is nothing it needs to balance. Symmetrical images should never produce tension or chaos. The powerful images of symmetry for me and my work are the most calming, a place where I can go to rest. I don't have to do the hard work of balancing my image. But you can't just have symmetry and have a great image. You need something else. The triangles in the mountains create that movement. The leading lines of the clouds give it structure to pull you back in. Having the clouds also prevents the eye from exiting out of the image and also creates those complementary colors between the coolness, the blue of the sky, and the warmth of the clouds. The other thing is it gives it ability for the mind to compare between the 2 parts of the image. A little bit of a game to see the differences between the top and the bottom, all of which is eye movement and brain movement, lots and lots of movement. Movement equals engagement. That's what we want within our images. So the next thing to consider is, how does our brain read images? We tend to read, most civilizations read left to right, and that is how our brain is trained. So our brain likes to follow movement from left to right. But the other part of it is most people look towards the left, up towards the left when they're remembering an event in the past, and towards the right when they're accessing things for the future. So maybe our brains associate left to right as past to future movement. Same thing also on the need for space. The brain wants some space around the objects in our images, to be able to visualize the moose coming into the scene and still having space and a place for it to move through. Same thing all around the image, for the mountains to the reflection, not making the borders and the parts of the image that are important feel crowded. This is also the concept of negative space, where you have space for an object to move into. So it's not just the moose, it's also the mountains. People need to or want to feel like those mountains still have room to grow if they want it. So space is just that opportunity for the eye to move around. The brain is allowed to not feel compressed. And it can begin to imagine or visualize what happens next, or simply rest, which is often the case. So not sure you believe me on the left to right movement. Well, I flipped this image. And what does it look like with the moose going from right to left? For those of you that know the Tetons well, that in itself feels weird. The angles of the mountain, I somehow seem to notice a little bit more, but the moose feels like it has more resistance, almost like she's not moving as easily through the image. And so maybe you want to compare and look at the two. Like I said before, the brain loves to compare. And between the 2 images, which is your favorite? It's still the top one for me. It still feels like it's a little less compressed and it has better movement. Same thing on that need for space. We want to be able to visualize the moose coming into the scene and still having space to move through. If I slightly crop that moose, or just want the mountains the way they are, didn't capture it the way we want, the image has a much more different feel. The eye or the brain can't quite complete the animal, and if puzzled and confused, it will oftentimes leave a scene and move on. So there are different theories on why framing works so well, whether we're using the framing of trees or objects or people. And when I look at an image like this, what I'm drawn to is how easily my eye stays within the frame and begins to discover new parts of the image, from the waves to the small rock islands to the small crescent moon to the color to the cloud textures to some of the textures within there. The other theory of why framing is an important compositional element is more ancestral. It goes back to our caveman days and that literal feeling that we're in a safe place where we can look out and see our prey, but also see our predators and be protected. This is what's called prospect refuge theory and has some elements in framing. The next one is different. And some people agree with this one, others don't. And this is called the rule of odds. And it's that dang brain of ours will always wanting to find order, wanting to compare and to contrast and to organize things into symmetrical compositions. Is this a perfect 5? No, but there's enough division between each distinct column to give it some space and for your mind to start to organize it and to compare. So why odds versus evens? Well, in evens, the brain will try to split them into groups and then split them again. So if you give yourself a group of 4, the brain will split it into groups of 2 and then split it again into 1 and be done. And I'll show you. So take this image as a 3 and you will find yourself comparing the subjects, finding the differences and the similarities, comparing each one to the others. How is the one on the left similar to the one on the right? How about the similar? How about the center ones? And then what about us 2? Well, now it doesn't work as well for me. It feels more compressed and there's no sorting. The brain quickly looks at this, takes a look at one, looks at the other, makes its determination and moves on, picks its favorite and moves on versus going back to the 3. It's going to compare all the way through. It's going to look at different parts and pieces. So the rule of odds, if you can do this in any type of photography, architecture photography, if you can get 5 windows versus 4 windows, or you can get 5 lamp poles versus 4 lamp poles, et cetera, you're going to have more compelling images. I can tell you that right now. Okay, so the eye doesn't see things in focus. It shifts from and within different parts of the image as you look at it live. And nature, you shift and you go further into an image. Your brain will put those in an image into focus as your eyes go deeper. But with differential focus, you lose focus deeper into the image and you start to come back to the front. And this next time you might take a different path through the image. So most of us know that the best way to blur our background is through a low f-stop, but the f alone will not accomplish blurring your background. You also need to get closer and place the focus in the one area, not throughout the image, which also brings out simplicity. If in doubt, simplify, especially when it comes to intimate landscapes like this. When you have that blurred depth of field, the mind tries to make some sense of the patterns and tries to figure out how far and for how long that pattern goes. You also might start to play how big of a narrative, how big is this plant? What is going on here, et cetera? How far does that extend? And so when we can play with these 3 elements together of simplicity and differential focus and depth of field, things start to be much more harmonious within our images. Okay, a couple more for a scene like this. This is the Channel Islands. So what this image brings forth is depth. Layers in the scene allow the brain to section off areas within the image. The flowers in the foreground, they might serve as an anchor. The lines of the rocks, they lead you further back into the image. The haze back there in the distance help you feel like the islands in the distance are a longer way off. Goes back to the principle of differential focus. That which is closest to you should be sharpest and easiest to see. That which is far away should not be in the same level of focus of what is close. So the concept of depth and how you position and place things in front of each other to bring forth depth and dimensionality. The other one is the concept of viewpoint, going back to the example from early on in Death Valley where I was getting high and low and different things. What you're wanting to look with viewpoint is how can you pull people into the scene? Too many photographers take their photographs at tripod level or eye level, which is for most people 5.5 feet high thereabouts versus getting low. And for me, I got low, and I could show the details on the rock, and I could let those lines within the rock really pull me into the scene. When we see the world from eye level, which we get much more interesting, excuse me, when we see the world from non-eye level, we get much more interesting things as we get lower. Details and perspectives we would not see otherwise. And then the final thing on this, actually not final, but the next one is color. And what we get in with color, and I'm teaching a class on this actually like in 2 hours, all about color. So if you want to come back in 2 hours, we'll teach another class. Another time, I say we can spend a night on color, which is actually in 2 hours. So the various color schemes, complementary colors, bring out the most engagement and should also be considered part of composition. So remember this, the eye will always go to the brightest colors in an image and will go over the top of the darker or cooler colors and seek out the warmth and the brightness. So for many people, when they look at this image, the eye kind of skips over the lines in the foregrounds and goes to the more golden dune. From there, it kind of bounces back, and I'm betting it finds its way back through the foreground. As humans, we're drawn to luminosity, contrast, details, textures, and the transitions between them. So if we have that opportunity to use colors in complementary ways like this, we start to see. So this is the color wheel mapping of this image. So this is mapped out on Adobe Color, and we can see exactly what's going on. So these are complementary. They're creating tension within our movement. The warms and the cools are one of the biggest ways to bring out more dynamicism in our images. All right, and the next part is filling the frame. And that concept is getting in close and filling the frame with your subject. So for this image, this was taken from a plane above the Grand Prismatic. And I was very selective on filling the frame with my focal length. So I was 160 millimeter focal length. That was the image I had pictured. I didn't need to show all the other extraneous stuff. I wanted to fill the frame with this whole amount of the beauty of the Grand Prismatic. And then this is also maybe a frame within a frame concept. We also maybe have leading lines concept, where we have the leading lines kind of coming out of the spring, leading you back towards the dark center. The framing here of the spring shore itself leading you back down as well. So this image, I have different ones. I can tell you it doesn't work for me unless it's that frame filled concept as well. The next portion is those balancing elements, creating a relationship between near and far. The French have a term for it, it's called repoussier. And then how does that foreground push or anchor the view into your image? This is also part of what's called forced perspective. So if we use a wide angle lens, distort something in our foreground to make it feel larger than it was in actual life. So if I go back a few slides really quick as well to this one, this is using perspective shaping. This mud crack, as I had my lens inches away from it, wasn't this large, but I'm able to distort it and bring out a different element of engagement with that wide angle lens that you wouldn't see otherwise. This image also uses balancing elements, like I talked about earlier, of color, the blue ocean and the greenish sand, not giving much warm light, and the eye being attracted to the sunset, but also coming back maybe to that more distant sea stack. In the ideal scenario, maybe I would have created a triangle between two sea stacks or whatever, but that's neither here nor there. The other part of this image and why this balancing image works, and you'll see it sometimes if you have a flat image, flat rock that goes across with no shapes or lines, it has a tendency to block the image. This one worked a little better. There's a little bit of a triangular shape of the rock that's kind of pushing and pointing you into the image as well. All right, so the last one of composition, and then we're going to talk about lines and shape, is repetition. Repetition is all about repeating elements within our images. This can be colors, this can be shapes, this can be textures. But the other important element of repetition is filling the frame within that. So finding that repetition and filling the frame so it feels endless. It goes back to those other principles earlier. So, okay, so we might be the master of our own thought, but we are still slaves to our own emotions. And the truth is we have chances to take control of our images as we go forward, where we can be a little bit more in control of the emotional impact our images have on ourselves and others. But where do we start? So here's one of the charts I'll send you. This is called the Mood Lines chart. And this comes from a company called Zevin Design. It's a free chart, but and there's all kinds of different moods on here that could be portrayed with lines within our images. And yet there's a whole bunch, I'd say, that's overwhelming. There's 48 lines on the sheet, but there's a lot of stuff on here I would want to get rid of. Instability, I don't want to show that. I don't want to show indirect or plotting. I want things to feel more direct. I don't need to show digressive. Sorry, I can't see that one. I don't want to show things about falling. I don't want people to feel like unstable. I don't want to show indecision or weakness. I don't want, so the list goes on and on. Things I don't want to show: friction. I don't want to show instability. I don't want to show dividing. I don't want to show other things I can't see what happened. Tenacious, unwavering. So they just keep going on and on of things that you probably don't want to show. So as I'm seeking out chaotic, confused, rough, rasping, grating, all these different things are not ways I want my images to be described or what I want people to feel. Then you get into things, maybe you want things to be direct, maybe about parallel, some opposing with harmony, maybe some elements of opposing. So there's things, static or focal fixed. And so these kind of things start to leave. So anyways, I end up with 7 categories of lines that I get down to, which I think are things I want to bring forth: activity, stability, structure, horizontal, the dramatic, the inspiring, the concept of jagged or masculine lines, also feminine. These types of lines become a big part of the images. And we'll talk about this. People are like, wait a second, I don't see lines sometimes, or people will say, I don't understand. And now we're going to go through a lot of examples beyond just leading lines. And so before we start, we're going to have to take it away. And I'm talking about color. And although color is something we can become too reliant upon to save the day within our images, people notice color the fastest. And if we become too reliant on colorful, we lose that emphasis and focus and the ability to focus on the lines and shapes within our images. And think of it this way: color should complement, not be the driver of our images. And so photographing in black and white will make you a much better compositional photographer. So either photographing images and looking at them and then converting them to black and white, or changing your LCD screen to photograph in black and white, and you'll still have the color image, is going to make you a much better photographer in seeing the lines and the shapes and how you can tell stories with them. So I'm going to show that now. So desert photography is not for everyone. The chaos of the photography subjects, the harsh light, the hot temperatures, the sand, that can find your way almost into anything. I was in the desert last weekend, and I pulled out my headphones this morning and was shaking sand off them. But the payoffs can be nice, and you're guaranteed to have to stretch your creative muscles in the desert. So the biggest challenge we have is how to bring order out of the chaos, to find elements that stand out and communicate what we're seeing or experiencing. So elements with jagged lines, things that are hard, arranged correctly. These types of things in our images are firm or rigid, things that are not easily bent, broken, or pierced. They're also vigorous, strong, healthy, full of energy lines. And this type of image uses that inherent geology of the landscape to tell that story of activity and energy and firmness, and beginning to tell that story of the landscape, and also starting to tell a little bit of the story of what we feel in our images. So remember this image for earlier, in this particular one, we have a lot of good compositional elements going back to the rules of composition. Well, let's talk about the lines. So we're looking at masculine lines within mountains. And if we follow the ups and downs of these peaks, the jaggeds, we get to see a lot of that strength within our image. And then we have the other ones, the more feminine lines within our images, within the valleys, within the trees, much more picturesque portions of the image, a lot of dynamicism that's going on. And mountains are extremely dynamic. They're ever changing and shifting, and they bring forth a ruggedness and a beauty while maintaining a high level of strength. And these two-dimensional lines may lie flat on paper, but they don't lie flat in our minds. They start to create that movement we want. So that's the first part of those lines. Then we get into horizontal lines. You guys still see the presentation? Sorry, I said something pop up my screen. Annoying. Okay, so take away some of the color and passive lines in the sand ripples on the beach are accepting and they're allowing of what happens to them without active response or resistance. People can walk on these lines. Waves could crash in and wash them away. The water could drain away and dry these out. These lines are open and allowing. They're not showing force. Look at the positive and forceful lines of the waves that are crashing. These are lines that are confident. There's no doubt that they're going to crash. They've traveled a long way to crash forcefully on that beast. Sometimes they're even described as bold or forceful and having that assertive present. Then we have the parallel lines of the second level of waves after that energy, that boldness has been dispersed. And these are open to exist in parallel to each other. Some of the power has been removed, but yet they're still regal and great. And not all the horizontal lines within this image are in the sand or the water. They're also in the clouds, the horizon line, what's framed within there, some calmer lines that are not showing or projecting nervousness, anger, or other strong emotions. And then we also have the pier with its simple direct lines extending and moving from one place to another by the shortest route possible. So any idea of what draws you to waterfalls? Anyone that's ever stood on a raging torrent and tried to carry on a conversation would be hard pressed to say it's peace and calm. And I would say it's strength and stability that draws us. Strength is the capacity of an object to withstand great force or pressure. Water feel like they're powerful, but in that power, you also see and feel stability. What is more powerful than a soft substance like water that cuts through rock? And have you ever looked at a waterfall and thought, wow, I wonder if it'll turn over? Not like a tree, waterfalls bring about stability, something that's not likely to give way or overturn. So the framing and the lines and the shapes within our image here brings forth a lot of that communication. The most common element in nature is the vertical line. They are almost everywhere. But when was the last time you stopped and thought, wow, look at those great vertical lines versus exclaiming, wow, look at that tree? Feeling inspiration is one of the most impactful things we can have in our images or feel in nature. And this is the invitation that nature extends to us to be mentally stimulated to do or to feel something. So if we can build upon the nobility of these vertical lines, we also start to bring forth some dramatic, some exciting, some impressive. And we see these lines in composition. We have life and death. We have the life lines of this tree, the live trees behind it, and the death lines of this regal cottonwood that's still there. It also encourages us to rise. This regal tree still stands tall even in death. It still attains something. So the juxtaposition of this between life and death, between the two types of vertical lines, is a lot of interesting stuff. And then the other part of line, the more elegant cousin, is curves, the flowing and rolling. How do they feel and look? But you know there's more, that smoothness. The smooth flow of sand doesn't have abrupt stops and starts. That's the calming nature. The swelling nature of the sand dunes gives that peace and calm, while the sliding nature allows the eye to move. Images like this oftentimes evoke feelings of currents or streams when your eye flows down over the dunes and out into the distance. But there's also a little bit more. The way the angles flow in a downward way is not structured. There's no structure, so there's elegance and grace in that lack of structure. And any place that we can go for elegance, smoothness, and grace, the eye is likely to spend time there. So these are the downward flowing lines of sand. How about the upward flowing, the rising lines? When we rise, we start to find refinement, these things that are done in precise or subtle manners, like the small refined dune here. But we also find some optimism and feeling hopeful and maybe even confident about the future, like in the middle portion of this dune. Maybe aiming for some success and purpose, a little bit more ambition. I want to be a bigger dune. I don't want to be a smaller dune. But we also have some of that primitiveness, that smaller dune here that's regal. It doesn't have the immense strength and power of the bigger dunes there. And there's so much feeling of motion that goes on in images like this. A couple of other things related to lines. We have growing and developing lines where they kind of branch out. The mix of lines and trees, they bring forth a more complex, mature, or advanced structure. Not just limited to trees. We can also see these in estuaries. This is a drone image, estuary drone image, to get a sense of how rivers start and where they're created as well. Flowers oftentimes form a more meandering, casual, relaxed, more humanistic type thing, but not limited to just flowers. We can sometimes find the more humanistic, like in the toadstool hoodoos in just outside of Kanab, Utah. And then we get into that concept of increasing or expanding. So this is the image from earlier, but now showing the expansion portion by using those lines to tell the story of that expansion or increasing portion of stuff. And the last thing I want to say on lines, and we'll quickly go through shapes, is they can be used in tandem also. So I have the lines in the clouds from the long exposure and the lines in the rocks forming to concentrate or assemble the eye out there in the ocean and kind of fixate it out there as well, which is good. So like I said, use the lines going through the image. Okay, so the last thing on lines, this one's a little shorter, is the concept of the line to emotional response. And what we have going on here is how these lines come together to start to show bigger shapes and different types of response. So angled lines, these can bring forth agitation, confusion, clash, insecurity. But with a clear focal point or the proper use of shadows and highlights, we can make sense of an image like this. They don't need to be about clash. Similar thing to something like this, where we've talked about vertical lines ad nauseum, but before, think about how these vertical lines of these aspen trees start to work together. Vertical lines that are working in a way of depth, of lightness, differing textures, bringing out some of that stability and awe. Awe is a superpower descriptor in our landscape photography, that feeling of reverential respect mixed with wonder. So anytime we can bring out awe, we're going to get it. We also have the different types of horizontals and how the horizontal lines can start to form shapes and combine with color. So going back to the complementary colors, I talked about that, where we get the harmonious. It's a big thing we can get, harmonious arrangements of colors and form, providing that restful visual effect. They will always, horizontal shapes will always bring out more calm. They are shapes at rest. Radii is actual category of lines. With radii, we see glory and devotion, unity, ambition, freedom. But as you break down each one of these, that doesn't even seem out of line. I mean, how much glory and devotion do we see and feel within the landscape? Seeing a beautiful sunset, seeing a beautiful scene, ambition. Oh gosh, I want to get better. I want to capture that image more concretely to what I felt, et cetera. And then freedom. What is more freeing than a beautiful landscape seem to you? Also have radiation, shock and attention, a shock, a sudden, a surprising event or experience. This picture gets your attention. But interestingly enough, night sky, we often want more peace, more calm, the ability to wander. This is what I would call a photographer's image. Photographers like this image. They appreciate the technical portion that went into the creation of this image, whether it was stacking or planning or whatever else. The general public don't understand it and they don't like it because it doesn't bring forth that calm. It doesn't bring forth that feeling of wonder. It brings forth much more shock as well. Next portion is spirals. They're rare in our photography, but it's that combination of curves and lines and motion. We can't help the feeling some of that power, enthusiasm as we explore the image. The eye can't resist being led down or back up within an image, finding new patterns. You feel so much power, excitement as well within an image like this from the top and the bottom. You have lines coming down from the top and the spirals coming up from the bottom. We also have triangles. Yes, I love the mountains. Someday I hope to give a talk just on the mountains. But what triangles bring about is that feeling of stability and that permanence. And so there's so much peace and stability and permanence. And I think that's why so many people gravitate towards the mountains. Side thought is, who would have thought of Half Dome as a triangle? Get into a different angle, you see it differently. And then curves, like I mentioned, are lines, more elegant cousins. Then we get into rhythm, that refined movement, some charm. I find a lot of delight within this image of the wave that I captured, the way the lines rise and fall, the difference in their textures and their widths. as they go through. And then light, as I mentioned, this is an entire segment I teach, crucial element. But the underlying thing about light is that underlying emotion of light. And what do people feel most often? And I'd say it's most of the time, it's that hope or that love, that intense feeling of deep affection as well. And then we have to be careful as well with things like obliques, because we can bring out combat or confusion or clash. So we have to find ways to make order out of this. This image, as photographed here, has too much confusion. There's too many lines going in different directions versus changing my composition and minimizing the lines intersecting, using diagonal obliques to lead you into the image, bringing some uniformity some ways through the image as well. So some of these things are pretty abstract, rectangles, triangles, shapes and stuff. But one thing that is not abstract is circles. They're not that prominent in nature, but they have huge emotional meaning, immensity through their large size, large scales, extents, vastness. Play around things like unending time, infinity, like we see with the eclipse, and then things of equality as well. These are all things that circles represent. Similar things as well. We can get into ovals, that gracefulness, like the curvature of Crater Lake, or the feminine shapes like that Sea Cave in Pismo Beach, or even just things like the rock from Valley of Fire, where we see this continuation in the form of different mirroring repetitions of ovals within the image and how they start to shake out as well. And then we have formal subdivision, which is very closely related to the concept of symmetry. So same thing. So how our images are drawn up and how they can portray different elements within the image. Okay, so one final thing, and then we'll be done. One is I want to leave you with something to take into the field. People say, oh, this is great image. This is great information. What do I do with it now? And I'm going to give you the 4 R's that I've created: the reason, the rhythm, the removal, and the radiance. And so keeping these 4 things in mind will change dramatically and simplify all that you need to worry about. And I'll give you the examples real quick. So the reason, why are we there? So I took this image this last week. So this is Park. This is in Eureka Dunes. What's the reason I'm here? This is a 24 millimeter lens. I'm not telling any bit of the story. Then I go to a 50 millimeter lens, maybe a little bit. And then I go to my 135 millimeter, not lens, 135 millimeter focal. Now I'm starting to tell the story. And then I go to my 300. And now I've isolated out exactly within the elements. And so the reason is about why are we there? What are we building the composition around? And thinking about that initial composition, but then also thinking about things like focal length and how that subtly starts to shift things around and how that will drive what you're trying to showcase. The next is the rhythm and how it works cohesively. I've talked about the cohesion within images. So we got the rhythm, the balance. Where do we see dominance? How are we flowing through an image? The next part is the removal. So the third is removal. Where do we see distractions? So this is the unprocessed image. Distractions in these red spots here, these white things here, these pieces of pine things here, the darker, the brighter as well, minimizing these things that intrude into the image, impact our elements. So it's about what we can remove in the field and also what we can remove in post-processing. And then the final element of the 4 R's is the radiance. And when I say radiance, this is part of composition, is the radiation of the light and how is that working within our scene. So you may not have any real light, but you might see variations in the brightness and the vegetation or the elements that have differential colors. And so really looking at that radiance component as they go through. Okay, a couple final things and we'll take questions. First is I have a bunch more great learning opportunities. These are paid, affordably priced paid classes coming up. And so if they are recorded, if you also want to grab them later. So like I mentioned, the next one I'm teaching is in now an hour and 35 minutes on science and emotion of color and nature photography. So I don't know if you guys will join me for that one. And then I got some other ones coming up. Some deeper dive classes about Lightroom and Photoshop and preparing images for print. Those are longer classes, shorter class, smaller class size, etc. This is all on my website. I also have a bunch of cost-effective tutorials. These are like $15. Go into much more detail on techniques about things we brushed on today, whether it's light or color, or night photography, etc. And then the final thing, oh, I don't know, I guess I took that slide out. Sorry about that. And then I also have a bunch of free presentations coming up. I don't know what happened to that slide. Either I skipped over it or I somehow deleted it. I got a bunch of free presentations coming up, and I'll send you information. I have one on the power of creation, talking about the creative process. I'm doing another one month after on fear in photography, understanding emotion in our photography, and then kind of ending the season with ending the spring with vision, how I discovered my vision, how I work my vision within my work. So, all right, that is a wrap for the presentation. How about questions?
Can you hear me now, Nick?
I can, Matt.
Awesome. Let me turn my camera back on. Awesome. That was awesome. I hope everybody enjoyed that. Again, guys, if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A. We're also going to be getting a recording of this in case you guys want to go back, and there's a lot of information that covered a lot of amazing stuff, some really great tips, especially if you're just getting started in landscape photography. This is, just really useful information that's going to drastically change and improve your landscape photography. We're going to be taking a recording of this and putting it on our YouTube channel as well. So make sure to check out Gear Focus on YouTube. It's just youtube.com/gearfocus. A couple people had asked what Gear Focus is. Really quick, Gear Focus is an online marketplace to buy and sell camera gear. And it was made by creatives for creatives with less than half the fees of eBay, and strictly for camera, photography, filmmaking gear. And we're always here to help answer any questions. We've got a lot of exciting things coming for Gear Focus in this new year here, and including more workshops and tutorials. So I think everybody could agree that we'd love to have you back, Nick, for another one. I know I would. So I've been shooting photography a long time. So, whether you're a seasoned professional or you're just getting started in photography, you can always learn something. You're always catching something that maybe you didn't think of, or things that you forgot, right, Nick? I mean, how many
Exactly.
As creatives, we go out in the field, we're worried about the gear, we're worried about setting everything up and the conditions, and we're not thinking about composition. We're not really opening our eyes to the light. All those things that Nick covers in a lot of his tutorials. So definitely check out Nick's stuff. Again, Nick, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Do we have any questions? Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, one came in direct to me, and it was, what is the most, if you had to pick one, which are people sometimes ask, element that's the most important. And my answer, the one element I look for more than anything else is leading lines. How I can lead my subjects into the scene, especially in forest photography and especially in desert photography. Those two elements more than anything else is like, how do you make order out of the chaos? So leading lines is the number one compositional element, and then the number one element I look for is light, and how I'm watching the light over the landscape and kind of looking at what's coming. And most of my more compelling images have some element of reading the light and anticipating a little bit of what I thought it was going to do to be able to create the image. So
that's great.
One of the questions that came in. So
Blair, yes, definitely a lot to think about. Clint, yes, we are going to post this on our YouTube channel, so go ahead and subscribe at youtube.com/gearfocus. We'll get that up within the next 24 hours, probably, whenever Nick has the recording over to us. Thanks for your comment, Bill. Thanks for everybody for joining us. We're going to have a lot more of these. Gear Focus is free to sign up at. Make sure you sign up to our newsletter, because we're going to have a lot of other things coming out, a lot more videos, just helpful tips and things like that. Nick, you were talking about light. One of the things struck my memory going back to college photography class, darkroom days of black and white.
Yes.
Ansel Adams, obviously that was like my intro to photography in junior high, I think, many years ago. And my first photography instructor always made us shoot black and white, couldn't shoot color, obviously. But that really helps with the lighting. And maybe you can give one more tip on that in your thoughts on doing black and white, because a lot of times, like, you'll have mountains or something like that, and they'll blend into the sky and they'll blend into the foreground, and you're not getting that separation and that depth of field and drawing that eye through the photo, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I teach a class on black and white photography, and I talk ad nauseum about, well, a couple things. One is Ansel Adams in this day and age would have been called a photo manipulator for how much dodging and burning he did in the darkroom.
Yeah,
he did a ton of lightening and darkening of his black and white images. There's not a single image of his that he hasn't significantly altered to bring out those contrasts. And so when I talk about light, I talk a lot about transitions and looking for those transitions within images. And so that transition between lights and darks. And so with black and white photography in this day and age, you can set up your camera to capture in monochrome, and you'll see the monochrome preview on your camera, but it'll still be capturing a full raw color image for back at home. And so sometimes if I'm out in the field, especially if I'm shooting things with a lot of details and textures, I'll switch my profile to monochrome, and I can see the lines and shapes better versus relying by or being overwhelmed by the color. That's the other thing that sometimes happens. We can sometimes get overwhelmed.
That's a great tip. And I think we've done that before. I find myself like spurts of shooting nothing but monochrome, but I forgot. That's a really good point for those who don't know. It's still recording it, all the color information that you can pull back later, but that's definitely a good practice technique to, switch to monochrome.
Yeah. And the other question that came in is, what is Photo Pills? And so Photo Pills is it's a $10 app. One time you can get it either on Android or iPhone, and it's a extensive planning app that you can use to calculate sunrise and sunset times. It has a virtual reality feature, which I showed you in one of those screenshots, where it'll show you exactly where the Milky Way is going to be and at what time you're going to be able to see it. It has things to capture your depth of field. You can do time-lapse calculations, all this stuff. It's a great tool. And then they also have a ton of free online. You don't even have to down the app. They have a ton of free online classes and materials as well. So I love Photo Pills. It's a great app. I use it all the time. So
that sounds cool. I'm going to check that out as well.
Yeah.
I know there's been a lot of apps I've checked out for, just tips on locations and things like that. So now I think didn't we speak about that, about locations that you had worked on, location finders for landscape photography, like cool spots to shoot.
I have different books I use to find different things in maps, but just
okay. Gotcha.
Well, good. Well, I'll go on. I think we can go on ahead and wrap up, because it's getting late out there, dinner time, and then I'll convert the recording and send it out to the attendees and the non-attendees, and go from there. I appreciate the opportunity, Matt.
Hey, thanks so much, Nick, for coming along. And I know we'll chat soon. And once this pandemic's over, we're going out and shooting. So.
Yeah, sounds great.
Enough talk. Let's do it.
All right, perfect.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great night, and we'll see you in the next one.
Perfect. Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye.